Marcus Grant had flown on countless planes in his life, but this particular flight from New York to London felt different the moment he stepped into the first-class cabin. The air carried that familiar blend of leather seats, expensive perfumes, and the faint hum of quiet conversations between power brokers who considered these skies their second home. Marcus, dressed in his tailored navy blue suit and polished shoes, moved with the quiet confidence of a man who had built an empire from the ground up, but unlike many of the other passengers who relished the attention of being noticed, he preferred to slip into his seat with little fanfare. He carried himself with dignity, his presence commanding respect without ever demanding it. To the casual eye, he was simply another successful businessman. Yet behind the calm expression was a man whose name made entire boards of directors tremble. Marcus was the CEO of one of the largest investment firms in the world, a company whose financial reach touched airlines, banks, tech giants, and real estate. But for now, he was just a passenger on a transatlantic flight, eager to relax and prepare for the keynote speech he would deliver in London the next morning. The cabin filled with the soft clinks of champagne glasses and murmured greetings from flight attendants who seemed to know the frequent flyers by name. When the meal service began, Marcus politely folded away his laptop, picked up the menu tucked neatly beside his seat, and scanned the options. The roasted salmon entree caught his eye. Paired with a glass of white wine, it was exactly the sort of light but satisfying dish he preferred while working. When the flight attendant reached his row, Marcus greeted her with a courteous smile and placed his order for the salmon. For a moment, her eyes flicked down at him, then back to her notepad, and something in her expression shifted. Her smile flattened, her tone hardened, and in a voice just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, she said, "That's not available for you." Marcus blinked, caught off guard, certain he had misheard her. "Excuse me?" he asked calmly, tapping the menu. "The salmon is listed right here." The attendant didn't bother to glance at the menu. Instead, she gave a dismissive shrug and said, "We're out. You'll just have to take whatever's left." There was no apology, no attempt at professionalism, only a sharp, cutting edge in her tone, as though his very request had been a nuisance. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. What unsettled him wasn't that the entree might have run out. He had flown enough to know it sometimes happened. But that only moments later he watched her carry the exact same salmon dish to a passenger seated 2 rows ahead of him, a white man who accepted it with a smile. The contradiction wasn't lost on Marcus, nor was it lost on the passengers around him who exchanged uneasy glances. Marcus leaned back, studying the attendant as she moved down the aisle, her manner softening when addressing other travelers. He wasn't given the courtesy of choice, only a command disguised as service. He could feel the heat of subtle humiliation pressing against him, the sting of being told, in not so many words, that he didn't belong even though his ticket had cost the same as everyone else's. For a moment, Marcus contemplated speaking up more firmly, but years of experience had taught him restraint. A public confrontation would give the attendant exactly what she seemed to want, a scene she could twist against him. Instead, Marcus simply offered a polite, controlled smile and said, "Very well, I'll wait for whatever you have left." But in that quiet acceptance was something more dangerous than anger. A decision forming, a reminder that the uniform she wore and the arrogance she displayed were underpinned by an airline he had far more control over than she could possibly imagine. She thought she was denying a meal to just another passenger, but in truth, she had just disrespected one of the very people who held the strings of her career. Marcus turned his gaze toward the window, watching the clouds roll by, and allowed himself a small, measured breath. He wasn't hungry anymore. He was planning. Marcus sat in silence, his fingers lightly drumming against the armrest as the clatter of silverware and the aroma of roasted salmon drifted around him like an insult. He wasn't a man easily shaken by disrespect. Years of boardroom battles and billion-dollar negotiations had taught him the value of patience and poise. But this was different, not because he was hungry, but because the act was so deliberate, so calculated in its contempt, that it echoed a lifetime of subtle dismissals he had faced as a black man who dared to rise too high in spaces that weren't built for him. The sting wasn't in the missing plate of food, It was in the smirk the flight attendant gave as she walked away, the way her voice shifted into warmth when speaking to others, but hardened when speaking to him, the clear message in her tone, "You don't belong here." He closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply, letting the hum of the engines soothe him as he gathered his thoughts. Around him, whispers spread among fellow passengers who had witnessed the exchange. Some stole quick glances at him, their faces betraying discomfort, while others deliberately avoided eye contact, unwilling to acknowledge the injustice happening just a few seats away. A businessman across the aisle, a man Marcus recognized from financial conferences, leaned over and whispered cautiously, "I saw what happened. That wasn't right." Marcus gave a small nod of acknowledgement but said nothing more. Words weren't necessary, not yet. What most people didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just another wealthy traveler. His firm, Grant Capital, held significant stakes in the very airline he was flying on. He had influence not only in its boardroom, but also in the daily lives of those who worked under its banner. This airline owed part of its existence to his investments, yet here he was being treated as though he were invisible or worse, unwelcome. He pulled out his phone, the soft glow of the screen illuminating his face, and opened a secure messaging app used only by his top executives. Without a trace of anger in his expression, he typed a brief instruction: contact the airline's chairman. Immediate review of Flight 782 staff. Incident recorded. Prepare board action. He pressed send, slid the phone back into his pocket, and folded his hands neatly in his lap as though nothing had happened. To the casual observer, Marcus was simply another passenger enduring the monotony of a long flight. But beneath the surface, gears were turning, decisions were being set into motion that would ripple far beyond this cabin. The flight attendant, still unaware of the storm she had unleashed, continued her rounds with that same haughty demeanor, refilling champagne glasses and laughing lightly at passengers' jokes. Marcus watched her for a moment, not with bitterness, but with the cool detachment of a man already envisioning her career collapsing under the weight of her arrogance. He wasn't vindictive by nature, but he believed in accountability, and what she had displayed wasn't just poor service, it was prejudice, plain and simple. The rest of the meal service passed, and eventually she returned with the leftover option, a wilted pasta dish that had clearly been scraped together at the last moment. Marcus accepted it with the same calm smile, thanked her politely, and set it aside untouched. His restraint wasn't weakness, it was power. For while she thought she had reduced him to nothing more than a denied passenger, he knew something she didn't. In less than 24 hours, her entire world would change. Marcus leaned back, adjusting his seat slightly, and closed his eyes as though preparing to sleep. But behind those closed lids was the vision of a press release, a board meeting, and a crew whose names would be on termination letters before the plane even touched down. The silence before the storm was always the most deceptive, and Marcus Grant knew how to wield that silence better than anyone. By the time the cabin lights dimmed and passengers settled into the quiet lull of the overnight flight, Marcus's decision had already taken root, and though he looked calm, every second brought the consequences closer. The incident, of course, hadn't gone unnoticed. Smartphones had captured the moment when the attendant denied him the salmon and then minutes later delivered it to someone else, and already a few videos were being quietly uploaded to social media by younger passengers who sensed the drama's weight. Marcus hadn't asked for their defense, but he knew the world had a way of amplifying injustice when people witnessed it in real time. Still, he wasn't leaving this in the court of public opinion. He was orchestrating something far larger. As the hum of the engines filled the cabin, a ripple of whispers spread like wildfire. People began Googling him, connecting his face to the headlines, their eyes widening as they realized who he truly was. Marcus Grant, the billionaire behind Grant Capital, the man who sat on more boards than they could count, including this very airline. The irony wasn't lost on them. The crew had disrespected the one man who had the power to change their entire lives with a single phone call. The tension thickened. Some passengers grew bolder, exchanging looks of disbelief, while others leaned back nervously, clearly afraid of what this revelation meant for the crew's future. The flight attendants, however, remained oblivious, continuing their service with false smiles, never realizing that each step they took down the aisle was one closer to the end of their careers. Marcus didn't gloat, didn't rise to address the whispers, didn't even acknowledge the stares. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, leaned his head against the seat, and let the silence stretch. Power wasn't about raising your voice or demanding respect. It was about holding the world in suspense, knowing everyone else could feel the storm coming even before the thunder broke. At 30,000 feet, while most passengers drifted into uneasy sleep, Marcus quietly reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, connecting to the encrypted in-flight Wi-Fi reserved for business-class executives. His fingers moved with precision as he typed a short message to his chief of staff. Board meeting. Immediate. Secure line. Within minutes, his screen filled with familiar faces, directors and senior executives who had scrambled out of their evening routines to join the urgent call. None of them questioned the timing. When Marcus summoned, they answered. With the calm authority of a man in full command, he recounted the incident not with anger or embellishment, but with the simple, cutting clarity of truth. This was not just bad service, he said evenly. This was a culture problem, disrespect at the highest tier, directed at the very customers we claim to value. The directors listened in silence, the weight of his words settling heavily over them. Then, with a nod, Marcus issued the order. The entire crew on Flight 782 is to be relieved of duty upon landing. HR will prepare formal notices, legal will oversee compliance. Public relations, draft a statement addressing zero tolerance for discrimination. No one dared to argue, they understood the gravity. On the other side of the cabin, the attendants continued their routine, blissfully unaware that their careers had already ended somewhere over the Atlantic. A businessman a few rows away watched Marcus closely, realizing he was witnessing the kind of quiet, decisive leadership that topples empires and builds new ones in the same breath. Marcus ended the call, set the phone aside, and sipped calmly from his glass of water, his expression unreadable. To anyone glancing his way, he looked like just another passenger relaxing on a long flight. But in reality, he had just erased an entire crew with fewer words than it took to order a meal. Power wasn't loud, it was absolute. When the wheels touched down at Heathrow, the cabin erupted with the usual shuffle of passengers gathering their belongings, but beneath the routine hum, there was a strange tension, as if everyone sensed something extraordinary was about to unfold. Marcus remained seated, calm and composed, his eyes on the window as the jet rolled toward the gate. The flight attendants carried out the landing protocol with forced cheer, unaware of the silent storm that awaited them just outside the aircraft door. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, 3 suited airline officials and 2 uniformed HR managers stepped aboard, their expressions grave. The lead attendant stepped forward with a polished smile, ready to greet them. But the smile faltered when she realized they weren't there for a courtesy check. All cabin crew of Flight 782, one of the officials announced firmly, "You are relieved of duty effective immediately. You will surrender your ID badges and remain on the ground for debriefing." Gasps filled the cabin as passengers froze in shock. The very crew who had strutted down the aisles with authority hours earlier now stood pale and trembling, stripped of their confidence in an instant. Some tried to protest, their voices cracking, but the officials remained unmoved, collecting lanyards and badges with clinical precision. Phones rose into the air, recording every second of the unprecedented scene. Marcus finally stood, adjusting his cufflinks with the same quiet grace he had shown all flight, and walked past the stunned attendants without a single word. His silence was louder than any lecture could have been, the embodiment of authority that didn't need to shout. By the time he stepped into the terminal, the videos were already trending online, headlines exploding across news sites. Black CEO denied meal in first class, crew fired upon landing. The airline's stock began to dip within hours, and by evening, their public statement echoed the lesson Marcus had wordlessly delivered. Respect is not optional. Discrimination has consequences. For Marcus, it wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. And as he walked through the terminal surrounded by whispers of awe, he knew the message had been sent, not just to one crew, but to an entire industry.